I thought that the tone really struck a presidential chord. He clearly has found his presidential voice. Most people find this a little earlier in the campaign cycle because they've been coached to do that. He was an uncoachable candidate for a long time, which was part of his appeal, but now he's sort of found that rhythm. The question is whether or not that rhythm is going to continue beyond the day and whether or not the discipline that he showed last night ends up being more common. And the other question is whether or not the tone sort of matches reality. And so his ability to kind of build bridges and talk more inclusively is really part of this larger problem that he's faced and I think is causing some of the slumping of approval ratings. So if he can have the tone and the speech match the reality, then I think he can probably steer into the skid on the presidency so far. But I don't know that we're going to find that because things have been real rocky so far.
Well, I can only speak to the immigration issues because that's what I focus on. And I thought in terms of the tone, it was interesting. It was very interesting that earlier on in the day there was this discussion, apparently confidential discussion with reporters that seemed to suggest that there would be a pathway to legalization with respect to undocumented people, and then that was left out of the actual speech, which was very interesting. But as far as the tone on immigration, I thought that he maintained his very, very forceful language about border, interior enforcement. He talked about the VOICE program, which is relating to people who have been victims of crime by undocumented immigrants. So his tone certainly, in terms of the speech, I don't think was any different with respect to immigration than it has been.
This was an issue that came up during the Obama administration, and the Senate was able to pass it, but the House rejected it. There was a lot of applause after the immigration discussion. Do you think that there's a recipe for getting Republicans who were reluctant the first time around during the Obama term to join him in the immigration reform issue that he talked about?
Well, I mean, that's a very good point, and you're referring to the Senate bill in 2013 that was passed. So it was passed by the Senate. It was Chuck Schumer was the author of that bill, and he had the so-called Gang of Eight, which was a bipartisan group that came together and really had a very, very interesting and expansive comprehensive immigration bill. The interesting thing is, I think, personally, speaking for myself, that the president is on board with respect to comprehensive immigration reform. I think what he was doing was telegraphing or signaling that, but then realizing that if he said it publicly during the actual speech, it would detract from the impact on his supporters.
Yeah. He sent aides off scurrying earlier in the day, saying maybe we should include that in the speech, and so there was a kind of ruffling about that, and ended up not making it. But
well, and then the New York Times pointed out something very interesting too, is that the aides, the people who are he's surrounding himself with, for example, Bannon, Miller, Jeff Sessions, these are people who have been staunchly opposing the Senate Bill 744. So there may be, and again, this is just speculation, but there may be a schism, arising with respect to some of his closest aides and what he really wants to do on immigration.
Yeah. I think that the president is in danger of overpromising. I mean, he had a big vision last night, which was about sort of putting America first and dreaming big, but that comes with a big price tag, and that price tag could end up in the trillions of dollars. Congress has had very little appetite to do a lot of this sort of spending. The budget that's coming up is going to require, I think, a lot of negotiation, because he said we're not going to have entitlement reform, which Republicans have said for decades that they need to have in order to balance the budget, which also the president's budget doesn't do. So I think it was almost DOA at the start, and the president's going to have to do a lot of groundwork to get some attention put in place for these issues, and I think immigration is one of those big issues as well.
Well, you mentioned price tags, so very interesting. On the Senate bill, the Congressional Budget Office and also Social Security Administration, they both had very interesting numbers with respect, and I'm sure you remember this in 2013, something like $297 billion reduced from the deficit with respect over 10 years with respect to the Senate bill if it had been passed. $700 billion reduced from the deficit by 2033. So I think the president understands this. I'm sure he's done that research. Social Security Administration, I think there was something like $200 billion in revenue or $300 billion in revenue over 10 years, and it would cost $33 billion. So, I mean, there's a real economic incentive that personally I think the president understands.
Yeah. And that's really I think the key for him is to try to get some kind of a groundwork to be able to show some progress on these policy issues. Politically, this is the real issue. I mean, he, I think, has got a core group of Republicans who will follow him, but that's a pretty modest herd. And his biggest goal, I think, last night was to not necessarily try to get Democrats on his side, because he already called the leadership of the Democratic Party either phonies or incompetent or any other number of names the last couple of months. So his goal here is not necessarily just to convince the Democrats, but rather to convince the Republicans to stay on board. And on things like immigration reform, on the budget, when it comes to tax reform, he's going to need to really reach across the Capitol dome to get those Republicans on his side, because presidents typically are in a position where if you can't get party unity, then you're not going to get a win.
Yeah, no, I agree. And again, with immigration, there have been staunch opponents in the Republican Party. Interestingly, as you remember, George W. Bush was for immigration reform, and it probably would have happened but for 9/11.
Yeah, and we saw the President Bush come out the other day and say that Donald Trump was essentially kind of off the rails on a lot of these things and should be respecting the freedom of the press. And I think it goes to this overall tone that although the president wanted last night to kind of shift the direction of his presidency, that's not something that happens with one speech. And so some of the commentators pointed to the fact that there was this great moment where they embraced the idea of this of sacrifice, right? It was this one individual soldier who had been killed in the raid in Libya, that was the moment the president sort of became the president. And I thought, honestly, there's a great moment there, but there needs to be more data collected, right? They need to have a larger track record. And so if his tone is going to shift in a meaningful way, he's going to have to really show it on paper. And part of that is legislation.
Well, and he's going to have to show it in terms of implementation.
Yeah.
So we're going to see, for example, with interior enforcement, deportation, CIR, comprehensive immigration reform, how he implements those ideas, and that will be the true test and result of his presidency.
I think that's right. Yeah.